Why is it so hard for you to believe? Is my physical existence any more improbable than your own? What about all that hoo-ha with the devil a while ago from that movie? Nobody had any problem believing that the devil took over and existed in a little girl. All she had to do was wet the rug, throw up some pea soup, and everybody believed. The devil you could believe, but not God. I worked in my own way. I don't get inside little children. They got enough problems of their own. Also, I'm not about to go around to every person in the world and say, look, it's me. I want to talk to you. So I pick one man. One very good man. I told him, God lives. I live. He had trouble believing too, in the beginning. I understood. I'm not sure how this whole miracle business got started anyway. The idea that anything connected with me has to be a miracle. Personally, I'm sorry that it did. Makes the distance between us even greater. But if a miracle helps you believe that I am who I say I am, I'll give you one. A good one. Let me see. What's my most impressive miracle? Pick a card. So help me. At the beginning of Goethe's Faust, we witness the transformation of the cavalier gentleman into a tiny mouse to nibble away at the pentagram that had been placed at the door of the good doctor to ward off evil spirits. Type of magic trick. But rather than confessing that he had cheated when caught, Mephistopheles instead cast the blame on Dr. Faustus. See this often in court for his imperfections in preparing the pentagram, aided in his persuasion by the earlier arguments of superiority advanced by Faustus, who had doubted Satan's power if he might actually be prevented from entering through such a tiny and simply crafted device, falling prey to Faust's own superstitions. A very clever manipulation, however, in psychology, similar to the new terms of contract presented to healthcare workers at the Conway Regional Health System in Arkansas, who, after years of an at-will employment agreement, turn to their employees who have elected a religious exemption to inform them that their education had been inadequate in healthcare if they had failed to know that the same development procedures in the vaccines for which they had now expressed objection were used in the development of at least 30 common medications that they were probably using and giving to customers or clients, patients, which they must now then swear or affirm not to use anymore on religious grounds in a test of their sincerity in faith. Not to mention the appealability of an employee in healthcare who had rejected at least 30 commonly prescribed medications. Essentially, a reasonable notice that regardless of the outcome of that encounter, that employment agreement had been terminated. Exit visas are imminent, regardless. And so, given this same craftiness and deception that was found by Robert McHugh when the prison officials in New York had not only attempted to provoke him into signing an unlawful oath, but also had attempted to conceal the fact and question the sincerity of his religious belief in court against the rules. And also quite unseemly because his religion forbade him from making oaths. One can expect an employer like Conway Regional Healthcare to resort to an attempt to cast the blame somewhere else for their mandate, rather than to take full responsibility for their own actions like a responsible adult. And in matters involving rights, generally the most often used defense is that the Bill of Rights pertains only to government action, and they, of course, are a private employer, totally exempt, immune, as it were, which brings us to a case with which most progressive attorneys at least should be somewhat familiar, and which we should find some interesting familiar patterns. Progressive Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the opinion for the Supreme Court in 1959, the very same year that desegregation after 5 years had finally come to the dominantly resistant county of Arlington that had even replaced the school board to resist desegregation. Proceeding, as it were, with all deliberate speed, and the case was Green v. McElroy, which begins with a recitation of the facts. The case involves the validity of the government's revocation of security clearance granted to petitioner, an aeronautical engineer employed by a private manufacturer which produced goods for the armed services. Petitioner was discharged from his employment solely as a consequence of the revocation because his access to classified information was required by the nature of his job. After his discharge, petitioner was unable to secure employment as an aeronautical engineer, and for all practical purposes, the field of endeavor is now closed to him. Closed door. Got it. So in Greenville, McElroy, like with the healthcare workers at Conway Regional Healthcare, we have a worker in a civilian employment. Ooh. And to apply the law, you always try to seek analogous facts. That means they very similar. What else is similar in this case? One glaring similarity is the last sentence. After his discharge, petitioner was unable to secure employment as an aeronautical engineer, and for all practical purposes, the field of endeavor is now closed to him. If you refuse to sign the attestation at Conway Regional Healthcare, you may lose your job under suspicion of untrustworthiness and labeled as a healthcare worker who rejects at least 30 commonly used medications. What is your employability? This would be pretty similar facts. And quoting from Wigmore on Evidence, a treatise familiar to at least actual litigators in law, not every attorney is a litigator, Chief Justice Warren said in defense of the contract, who had his clearance revoked because of his communist association, for 2 centuries past, the policy of the Anglo-American system of evidence has been to regard the necessity of testing by cross-examination as a vital feature of the law. The belief that no safeguard for testing the value of human statements is comparable to that furnished by cross-examination, and the conviction that no statement, unless by special exception, should be used as testimony until it has been probed and sublimated by that test has found increasing strength in lengthening experience, cross-examination, and I cherish the old rugged cross. And petitioner was discharged from his employment solely as a consequence of the revocation because his access to classified information was required by the nature of his job. One interesting fact that comes up in his revocation was that it was because of his associations with communists. And the petitioner, William Lewis Green, retained a pretty pricey attorney who has quite a few federal practice cases on his resume. Big cases. Carl W. verified, and he was able to argue that the communists were not Green's personal friends, but the friends of his ex-wife. Of course, if you are Robert Cardew, you have to represent yourself. But if you're someone like, actually, Cardew, but if you're a Fareed, then of course, you get the best law firm in New York, Manhattan. But verified. He was able to argue that communists were not Green's personal friends, but the friends of his ex-wife, placing some social distance between him and the communists that the government found sufficient to revoke his clearance. And he probably wore a dang mask. And this is a big takeaway that any student of Blake Moran, now over at George Washington University, should be able to tell you. As an administrative attorney, with all of the flamboyant flair that is instructed in his class. What do we say? Due process! Due process! What an exciting career in law. And in Green v. McElroy, the Supreme Court articulated the rule that regardless of whether the petitioner's employer was an private employer, where administrative action has raised serious constitutional problems, the court has assumed that Congress or the president intended to afford those affected by the action the traditional safeguards of due process, in your best Blake Moran voice. And what is due process? In 1997, when I was in Blake's class suffering, the Supreme Court stated in Washington v. Glucksberg the substantive component of due process provides heightened protection against government interference with certain fundamental rights and liberty interests. In the 1986 case of Secretary of Labor v. TP Mining Incorporated, the court stated that due process is the process that is due, you'll hear that often, under particular circumstances, does not invariably mandate trial-type proceedings. In 1960, the U.S. Supreme Court stated in Hannah v. Locke, this elastic concept of due process is described in the concurring opinion as follows. Whether the scheme satisfies those strivings for justice which due process guarantees must be judged in light of reason, drawn from considerations of fairness that reflect our traditions of legal and political thought, duly related to the public interest Congress sought to meet by this legislation as against the hazards or hardship to the individual that commission procedure would entail. And in that case, despite involving a contractor whose clearance had been revoked through a process, albeit because of his communist associations, Chief Justice Warren wrote, the issue as we see it is whether the Department of Defense has been authorized to create an industrial security clearance program under which affected persons may lose their jobs and may be restrained in following their chosen professions on the basis of fact determinations concerning their fitness for clearance made in proceedings in which they are denied the traditional procedural safeguards of confrontation and cross-examination. And after full consideration, the court concluded, the Supreme Court, that in the absence of explicit authorization from either the President or Congress, the respondents were not empowered to deprive petitioner of his job in a proceeding in which he was not afforded the safeguards of confrontation and cross-examination. And I cherish the old rugged cross-examination. But of course, if you are pro-vaccines, you may not know this. In fact, it's probably high that you don't know this because you don't know that one-ply cotton is not impervious to microbial penetration. And would not be motivated, if you did, to inform a person like informing employees in Arkansas about the 30 common medical products that had been prepared and developed with fetal lines, like medical information that had been occurring for years and years and years, and nobody told them until just now. But in the next installment, we shall return to this issue of due process with specific reference to the vaccines and how they would be treated in a court with regard to the right to a day in court, or at least some type of administrative procedure before even a private employer could sever a person from their job for simple refusal to comply with vaccines mandates under a religious exemption, as these sly bastards are trying to do in Arkansas. But until next time, recall that as Paul writes in his epistle to the early church at Ephesus, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. To those in faith, behold, therefore, for you are sent forth as sheep amongst wolves. Truly wolves. I've seen a few. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. I charge thee therefore in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. Have to do your homework. But after their own lust, they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. And they turn away their ears from truth. Seen it so many times. And shall be turned unto fables. In fact, are turned unto fables. Actually believed it. One-ply cotton, impervious to microbial infection. But watch thou in all things. Endure afflictions. Do the work of an evangelist. Make full proof of thy ministry. Live long and prosperous, thought voyagers. This briefing is unclassified. As you were, my name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. At least in pretext. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.
I used to be a Power Ranger in a former life.
Thunk, I could have had a vaccine. Say goodnight, Gracie. So help me. Let's keep Mike Webb away from all schools. Honest. Carry on.